Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 News. The chaos continues at Red Bull Racing. New details emerging as to exactly why Christian Horner was sacked in the way that he was this morning and where Max Verstappen was in all of these conversations that went down over the last couple of weeks. It seems relatively clear the Verstappen camp wanted Horner gone, but even now he is gone. Have Red Bull made a serious mistake? Because the rumour has it that Max is certainly not committing his future to Red Bull with Horner departing, and he is still very seriously considering the offer that may arrive at Mercedes. What else is going to happen over the next few hours? Very much interested in your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. I greatly appreciate it. This, of course, a picture of a quartet at Red Bull, of which there are now no longer any of these individuals remaining. Jonathan Wheatley has gone, a man who I'm sure would have wanted Horner's job, but he left for Sauber. Perez, Newey, and then, of course, Christian Horner, the man himself. He was there 20 years, and that is now no longer the case as of this morning. 405 races, 124 race wins, only 3 constructors ever. Ferrari, McLaren, Mercedes have more wins than that. 8 drivers' titles, 6 constructors' titles over the couple of decades that he was with the team. And yeah, did he make some errors, let's say internally and externally, with his relationships of Red Bull? Yes, absolutely. But does he still go down as one of the greatest ever team principals? There is no denying that, and there is a very good reason why the factory at Milton Keynes today were pretty much, it seems, united. I'm sure that some would disagree with this, but internally at the factory, pretty much united of gratitude for what Horner has done for that organisation and sadness about his departure where it is. And we'll see how and why that is the case in a second. The very interesting thing about all these announcements today, they're all coming out of Salzburg. They're all coming out of Austria. There was nobody, and we'll see the evidence of that from the Sky Sports guys in a second, on the ground in Milton Keynes to answer questions in the press, nothing like that. This was handled externally to the British-based racing team. Red Bull Racing do a post and say, thanks for everything that we saw. And even Max Verstappen gives a post. I mean, he has to say something, right? But he says, from my first race win to 4 world championships, we've shared incredible successes, winning memorable races and breaking countless records. Thank you for everything, Christian. He put this on Twitter. He put this on Instagram. It was doing the rounds, right? So yeah, a very successful relationship, but all good things come to an end. And if we look at the partnership here, Newey has gone, Perez has gone. Well, Marco is still there with Max Verstappen, but I think this is quite a telling shot, really, of some of the power struggles that happened. I mentioned this morning the death of Dietrich Mateschitz, the implications that had, and maybe that was where Horner's downfall really begun. Yeah, there was the Renault era and everything, but outside of that, there was an incredibly impressive build-up to the domination they had in the Vettel era, and then what we've seen over the last few years with Newey at the helm on the technical side. But over the last couple of years, really since 2023, it's all started to go relatively downhill. So Horner apparently was not given a reason for this. The rumour has it, last night the decision was finalised, and Christian Horner was informed yesterday that he would be turning up to the factory today and delivering a farewell speech to the 1,000 employees that work at Milton Keynes. Just to note, Horner has not been the only man to get sacked. Now, Oliver Hughes and Paul Smith, close allies, aides, I would imagine, of Horner, Chief Marketing Officer and Director of Communications. Those are not small roles either. They're also gone. Of course, Horner's stealing the headlines for good reason. He's the CEO and the head of literally every single department. And that is one of the other reasons that cause serious problems here. And I'll do a bit more of an explanation as to my theory as to why that's become such an issue and really why Horner was butting heads with a lot of people internally and why this felt a little bit inevitable. The timing is still very interesting, right? Because I feel like Horner leaving Red Bull felt, honestly, like only a matter of time. The way that that team was trending, the continual struggles with the car, the problems with the second driver, Max maybe wanting to leave. I think Horner leaving and being blamed for some of these issues at some point was going to happen. And even with all the lingering inappropriate behaviour allegations of last year that were cleared, right? But even with that lingering, it's raised questions as to whether this was too sustainable. But to do it now, mid-season, kind of in the same way that Red Bull used to sack their drivers mid-season, maybe what goes around comes around. So Horner leaves, and this was Craig Slater and David Croft here at the Milton Keynes factory, and they were discussing some of the key details. So these were some of the comments, and I thought these were pretty interesting. He addressed addressed the team this morning, hugely emotional. He broke down, got a huge ovation. The staff have been told to not give any comments to the media, but actually they did speak to staff. So, I think this tells you something about the way that Horner was perceived internally and the impact that he had at Red Bull. That the staff were told by the Salzburg head office, no comments to the media on the Horner stuff, whatever. But there were many that were talking to the journalists and were unified in their disappointment and sadness for a man who unified their team. So I thought this is all very telling. And look, whatever you think about Horner from an external perspective, so many of those individuals working at Red Bull would not have a job or a career in Formula One if it was not for the team that Horner built over the last couple of decades, the success that he helped bring to that team, the bonuses that come along with that. It's understandable that Horner was a difficult man to remove because the team, generally speaking, I'm sure that there are many at Red Bull who would not necessarily agree with Horner staying in that role based on things that have happened over the last couple of years. But generally, there is a big sense at Red Bull that Horner is their leader, he is the man for the job, and sacking him with all of that heavy support on side was always going to be a very difficult thing to do. But it's a decision that they have now made. And the question is, why now? Is it due to, let's be honest, the Max Verstappen situation? He's become an increasingly important part of that team. He was always a very important part of the team, but recently, given the way that the car is, Max is the only one, at least that they put at that team, that can seem to drive the thing. He's the only guy giving them the results. And at the end of the day, their results have decreased dramatically. They're now fourth in the championship. The last time they were fourth was back in 2015, right? So it's been a long time since they've been struggling in the constructors as they are right now. And at some point, heads were going to roll as a result. We maybe thought that could have happened at the end of the season, possibly, but no, it's happening right now, and you might wonder whether there was a trigger for it, and whether that trigger was Max Verstappen's, let's say, displeasure with the current state of Red Bull Racing and the increasing interest from not only Mercedes, but mainly Mercedes in acquiring his services very shortly indeed. Now, his manager said a couple of very interesting things about this, because there is a theory, and I would say this theory is generally substantiated, that Horner leaving increases the likelihood that Verstappen stays. Whether Max was absolutely adamant that he wanted Horner gone, that does not quite seem to be the case, but it's certainly true that Verstappen's camp, his team, Helmut Marko even, after the power struggle that they went through before, would probably be pretty happy with Horner out of the team. And the chaos and the politics and all of that stuff internally at Red Bull has been an absolute nightmare. And just before I forget, I'll just comment on the way that this has been happening for Horner, right? Because as far as I'm concerned, it all started with the death of Mateschitz towards the end of 2022, and there was an opportunity to gain some serious power within the organisation. Horner has run that team for 20 years, still, as far as we understand, does not have any ownership stake in the team. You know how Christian Horner is. He looks at Toto Wolff and he says, damn, this guy's won a lot of championships, so have I, but Wolff's a billionaire. He owns 30% of the Mercedes Formula One team, and he's become a very wealthy man as a result of it. That's never happened for Horner, and there was a theory anyway that Horner was talking to the Yovidya family and said, hey, look, I will run the Formula One project as a separate entity, give me ownership and I'll do it, I'll take it off the Red Bull books, and I'll bring the results with or without Newey, with or without Verstappen. Newey as well, he always wants his piece of the pie too. The reason why Aston Martin probably got his services over Ferrari is because Aston and Lawrence Stroll are willing to say, hey Adrian, we'll give you an ownership stake in the team, which is what he did. Ferrari would not have been willing to do that, and we know that that's how Newey likes to operate, and it seems like Horner was not so willing to do that. So there are a few decisions over the last couple of years which would have led one way or the other. Either Horner was going to picture this path for himself where he would, let's say, deal with his adversaries and get to where he wanted to be, or the alternative was that it all started to crumble down around him when we get to this scenario. Because I think with Horner, it's undeniable that what he's been able to build, and he's been an incredibly successful team principal, but it's also undeniable that some of the decisions that he has either made or been involved with over the last couple of years have led to where Red Bull are today and to their and his inevitable downfall. And I think that, ego has probably had a serious part to play in that. But to say that Christian Horner wouldn't be an excellent operator for another team, you know, I don't think is necessarily the case. But also, as I say, I think we tend to get a picture here of how Horner likes to operate, and he wanted more power in that team. That's how I see it. And his method of gaining that power has backfired with the loss of so many key staff over the last couple of seasons that now it didn't work out and they're not winning everything and Max might want to leave. That all of a sudden the chickens have come home to roost. So Max's manager Raymond Vermeulen says, we've got a contract with Red Bull, we are committed, Max wants to get the best out of the material, but we also realise the championship is impossible. And then he went on to say this, we were informed in advance about this decision by Red Bull management. It is up to Red Bull to expand on why they did this. We continue to focus on the sporting side and are looking for more performance so we can return to the top. In that sense, nothing changes. So this, I think, is particularly compelling. I think everyone kind of knows the Verstappen camp wanted Horner gone. Certainly Jos did. Max maybe wasn't adamant about it, but seemed to be on board with the idea as well. There's more evidence of that in a second. But Verstappen's camp is still saying, this doesn't change anything for us. We are looking for performance. We are looking for the best possible future. And in that sense, nothing changes. So if this is an attempt by Red Bull to appease Verstappen, yes, it may do that. 20%. But does it change how compelling Mercedes are compared to Red Bull or the other way around? Not necessarily, and there is far from a guarantee that just because Red Bull have got rid of Horner, that means that Verstappen is now going to stay. But it does seem, anyway, that Verstappen was at the very least on board with this decision. There was a rumour coming out of ESPN today that there were meetings over the last couple of weeks about Horner's future, and Mintzlaff, who's, top guy basically, he's wanted Horner gone for a long time, and Max were also involved. My feeling on it is that the Yavidya family, the 51% owners who at the end of the day kind of made the call and needed to be convinced by the Austrians if they were going to change their mind on Horner, who was their man for a very long time and understandably so, I think they were effectively told, look, if you keep Horner, you ain't keeping Max. And right now, what's the most important thing in the team? But they were also not guaranteed, precisely, that if Horner goes, that Max will stay, because that is still a conversation that needs to be had, and it makes the decision quite challenging. Van Haren, who of course is very close to the Verstappens, says that stories that Max Verstappen demanded Horner's resignation are nonsense, but it's also nonsense that he's now definitely going to stay. So, of course, look, Van Haren saying this, he is informed quite, widely by the Verstappen camp. So, take it with a little bit of a pinch of salt here, because, of course, he's not going to come out and say, oh yeah, Max wanted this and he pushed heavily for it. Even if he did, certainly his father did, right? So there's always more pieces to the puzzle here. And the rumour has it that, Verstappen, didn't demand that Horner left, but equally didn't say that he will stay for sure, and in the next month or so, we should get a definitive answer about this. So the question really is, why was Horner sacked and where next for him and where next for the team? AMUS put together an article talking about all of the reasons that have led to this decision. The primary one being around Max, right? Max is not happy with the current state of affairs, not very happy with some of the decisions that have been made recently, and Horner had to take the blame for that. And the results dropped to a level where Horner's, let's say, the difficulties that emerge behind the scenes and all of that politics that I mentioned has been underpinning this team for the last 3 years or so, really, that we've finally seen start to rise to the top. With all of that happening, it became a point where Horner was no longer defendable, I imagine, given the results weren't good enough. Winning cures rather a lot, and this season, as it's become clear that Max is not going to win the Drivers' Championship, now it's all kicking off. So there's a few things here. One of the elements is him owning so many different roles. This is Mintzlaff, by the way, here on the left-hand side with Marco and Verstappen, of course. But Horner was the owner of everything, right? He didn't own precisely anything, right? But what he did own were all of the projects. Everything Horner had dominion over, as it were. And that proved an issue. I think it was part of Horner's plan in terms of his consolidation of power and all these other things. But equally, that proved an issue for Verstappen, and they weren't very happy about all the roles that he had, and that was apparently a decisive factor. There is discussion that Max's departure now, the danger of it has been averted. But I wouldn't say that that is anywhere near true for sure. There's also talk about the driver decisions, and this is understandable, right? Because as I say, with Horner it goes two ways. There is clearly an amazing team principal there. There is a problematic team principal outside of the sport, and there is equally a team principal who has made, I would say very egocentric decisions over the last couple of seasons that have led to his and his own team's downfall. Now, what does that mean for his future opportunities is a very interesting question. But the Perez decision was interesting. Now, was Horner primarily responsible for that? Maybe not, but he was certainly involved. And the decision to sack Perez and pay him off a load of money to do so, to not get any better results with Lawson or Yuki either, has not really gone down a treat, let's say. And the other reasons are, there's a few of them, right? Obviously, the loss of many of the individuals, Newey especially, with the reasons that we described, was a big one, kind of sidelining Newey to some degree, not wanting to give him too much power or control or whatever in those scenarios, and, lack of results straight up, but also declining popularity. I mean, there was an interesting question back in Austria. The Verstappen grandstands were not fully sold out, and look, when Red Bull are winning, yeah, it's great, but then you sack Perez, you lose a lot of the fans in that region, Red Bull stop winning as much, and all of a sudden, someone's going to be coming for your neck. It is what it is, and Horner would have known that this was coming, and I think he was probably intending to get his power and his consolidation with the Yavidya family to such an extent that this was never going to be a problem for him, but the reality is that he wasn't able to do that, and it was inevitable that at some point someone was going to, commit regicide, right, and take out the king. So Horner was doing everything. Now that's going to be split up drastically so, and of course Lauren McKees is stepping into that role. He's done many things over the last few years. The question then becomes, what next for Red Bull, but also what next for Horner? So there's discussion that the Verstappen camp, and I think I would also agree on this with the Verstappen camp, whether Pierre Wache really has the minerals to diagnose and solve the problems with the car. There's a feeling that Horner and Wache were very close in their partnership, that actually, Horner was, when Newey was there and he was calling a lot of the shots in the top level perspective, Horner was very quick to say, well, it's not all about Adrian, it's a lot about Wache as well. He's leading up the team, doing a great job. The Verstappens aren't really convinced about that. They're like, well, it's kind of just Newey, wasn't it? And Horner's relationship with Wache was such that probably with Horner there, Wache was always going to be there too. With Horner gone, maybe that opens the door for them to get rid of Wache too. So I think the point that I'm trying to make here is that this does not end the turmoil at Red Bull. Maybe it only begins it, because as I've just mentioned, pretty much the whole factory in Milton Keynes were supporting what Horner has achieved in that organisation over the last couple of decades, and they have a lot to thank him for. So Horner being gone, he will have his supporters, right? He will have people that he selected that will, are loyal to Horner. Not to say that they wouldn't stay, but, there will be repercussions of this. When you've led a team for 20 years, you don't just get sacked and it's all sunshine and rainbows, right? There will be serious internal turmoil to get to a more stable spot. It may be better in the medium term, but I do think that for 2026, it's tough to imagine how this is going to improve their chances, let's say, which again raises questions, I think, on where Max should actually go. But I wanted to say a few words on Horner and where he might go, because you know what Horner's like. I've just talked about the, him being ego-driven as far as I see it. You guys may disagree, but I think you would struggle to do so. And where he goes next, because if I'm Horner, thinking how I think Horner thinks, he's like, okay, I want to go to another team and prove that I can do the same damn thing again and beat these clowns week in, week out. And where would that be? There's maybe a couple. He may take some time off. There may be some sort of gardening leave, but it doesn't appear that way, really. It seems like they've got rid of him, and if he wants to go somewhere else, that may be an opportunity there. We've not really heard or talked about anything on this yet. There's no crazy rumours around this. And there was a rumour that, look, Vasseurs' partnership with Ferrari is set to continue. The team's maybe happier with him now than they were a few weeks ago. Hamilton's on board, Leclerc's on board, but Fred wants more decision-making power. We know how the politics at Ferrari go, and that has been a weakness of the Ferrari setup, I think, is the fact that they do not operate like a Formula One team. They operate like a sports car brand that happens to have a Formula One team that isn't necessarily a top priority, and I think that causes some issues. maybe Christian Horner could be a man to do a job there. You know, this image has been doing the rounds. Lewis and Horner shaking hands recently. Not to say that this means anything, and obviously everyone would have their opinion on it, but there is going to be a lot of talk about where Horner might go next, because his record, as controversial as it may be, does speak for itself. And we know, because it's been reported numerous times, that yes, Horner has been contacted by Ferrari before in this type of way, right? Like, hey, can you come and work for us, please, and fix our team? And Horner said, no, I'm loyal to Red Bull, and they're loyal to me. Well, not anymore on at least one of those counts. So I don't know if there's any worlds where we see Horner in a Ferrari kit. I mean, it's very cursed. It is extremely cursed. There are a couple of other options that I will briefly go through. We don't even really know if this is an option yet, and if it is, it's probably not going to be anything in the immediate term. But I would be very surprised if Lawrence Stroll isn't thinking about having a conversation, because Newey's over there, and Newey, to be honest, he will have his thoughts about working with Horner. But if, like, what Lawrence Stroll does well is he understands people and what they want, and he knows how to get them on board by giving them what they want, and he's willing to do that because he thinks that's beneficial in the long term. There's many people who'll be like, oh, you want ownership? Like, you know, no chance, right? But Lawrence Stroll, will say, hey, Adrian, I'm happy to give you a percentage of the company, because it's, you know, you're going to make me more money by giving you this percentage because we're going to be a great team. And he could do the same for Horner. He could go to Christian and say, look, you know, I know you wanted more control and power and ownership at Red Bull than you had. I can give you that, right? We can make a deal work like that. You can come here, work with Honda, work with Newey, you know, bring Verstappen along as well. Although I don't know, creates issues, right? Because if Max and the Verstappen camp don't like Horner, then would Stroll sign Horner given that he wants Max? Probably not, but it depends on the setup. And also Andy Calder, Curran's top guy, has done a great job at Mercedes for years. So it's a conversation that Lawrence Stroll will think about, but maybe not fully have. The other one that, of course, you can't totally rule out is Alpine. You know how chaotic they are. Could you imagine like a Briatore Horner combo? It would be one of the most scandalous teams of all time, and I would be there for it. But, you know, we'll see what happens next. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's been a pleasure. I'm sure we'll be back tomorrow with much more drama. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care, and I'll see you next time.